This is a reading from Philotea, or An Introduction to the Devout Life by St. Francis de Sales. Philotea, or An Introduction to the Devout Life. Part First. Counsels and exercises for the guidance of the soul from its first desire after a devout life unto a full resolution of pursuing the same. Chapter 1. True Devotion Described. You aim at true devotion, my dear Philotea, because as a Christian you know how acceptable it is to the divine majesty. But inasmuch as trifling errors at the outset of any undertaking are wont to increase rapidly as we advance, frequently becoming almost irreparable, it is needful that, first of all, you should ascertain wherein lies the virtue of devotion. For there are many counterfeits, but only one true devotion. And therefore, if you do not find that which is real, you will but deceive yourself and vainly pursue an idle, superstitious form. Aurelius gave to all his works of art the countenance of the women he loved, and so every one colors his devotion according to his tastes and inclinations. One is given to fasting, and while he fasts he holds himself to be devout, although his heart is full of bitterness. And whilst he will not touch his lips with wine, nor even with water, for abstinence's sake, he scruples not to sully them with his neighbor's blood in slander and calumny. Another would fain be devout because he daily repeats many prayers, although at the same time he gives way to angry, proud, and injurious language amongst his servants or associates. Another willingly opens his purse to give alms to the poor, but he cannot open his heart to forgive his enemies. Another forgives his enemies, but only force obliges him to do justice to his creditors. Such men may pass for devout, but they are not really so. When the messengers of Saul sought David, they found only an image in his bed, which being dressed by Michal in David's garments, deceived them so that they imagined it to be David himself. Thus many persons clothe themselves with a garb of external devotion, and the world believes them to be really devout and spiritual, whilst in truth they are mere statues or phantasms of devotion. True, living devotion, my Philotea, implies the love of God. Indeed, it is itself a true love of him in the highest form, for whereas divine love enlightening our soul is called grace, and makes us pleasing in his sight, so, giving us power to do good, it is called charity, and when it reaches that point of perfection, wherein it not only causes us to do good, but to do it earnestly, frequently, and readily, then it is called devotion. The ostrich never flies, the common fowl flies but seldom, and then heavily and near the ground. But the swallow, the dove, and the eagle are ever on the wing. They fly far and easily. Even so, sinners rise not to God, but always grovel on the earth in pursuing earthly things. Well-meaning people, who are as yet not truly devout, mount up to God in good works, but rarely, slowly, and heavily, whilst the devout fly to him perpetually, soaring lightly. In short, devotion is spiritual agility and vivacity, by means of which charity works in us, or we in her, with love and readiness. And as charity leads us to obey and fulfill all God's commandments, so devotion leads us to obey them with promptitude and diligence. Therefore, no one who fails to observe all these commandments can be truly virtuous or devout, since to that end he must have charity, and further, thorough readiness and eagerness to fulfill the laws of charity. And as devotion consists in perfect charity, so it not only makes us active, ready, and diligent in keeping God's commandments, but furthermore it stimulates us to the eager and loving performance of all the good works we can attain unto, even such as are not enjoined us, but only suggested or counseled. Even as a man just recovered from an illness walks on his journey only as far as is absolutely necessary, with pain and difficulty, so the repentant sinner treads in God's ways heavily and slowly, until, having attained the grace of devotion, he resembles the healthy and light-hearted traveler, who not only proceeds on his way, but runs and leaps with joy in the ways of God's commandments, hastening into the paths of his heavenly counsels and inspirations. In truth, charity and devotion differ no further than flame and fire, For charity is a spiritual fire, which when it flames brightly becomes devotion. And devotion adds to the fire of charity a flame which renders it ready, active, and diligent, not only in keeping his commandments, but in carrying out his heavenly inspirations and counsels of perfection. Chapter 2. Fitness and excellence of devotion. Those who would have hindered the Israelites from journeying into the land of promise described it as a land that devoureth the inhabitants thereof, that is of so noxious an air that the life of men therein was short, and that its inhabitants were giants, in whose sight the children of Israel were but as grasshoppers. Numbers chapter 13. Even so, Philotea, does the world calumniate holy devotion, representing devout persons with a gloomy, sad, and irritable countenance, and pretending that religion creates melancholy and unsocial men. But even as Joshua and Caleb declared that the land of promise was good and fair, and that the possession of it would be easy and pleasant, so the Holy Spirit, speaking by all the saints and our blessed Lord himself, assure us that a devout life is a lovely, a pleasant, and a happy life. The world sees only how the devout fast, pray, and bear reproach, how they nurse the sick, give alms to the poor, restrain their temper, repress and extinguish their passions, refrain from sensual delights, and perform similar actions which in themselves and taken alone are hard and painful. But the world does not see the internal, hearty devotion which renders all such actions easy, pleasant, and grateful. Watch the bees, how they suck from thyme a bitter juice, but as they suck it, it is converted into honey, for such is their property. Tell the worldly man, in truth, the devout find many hardships in their works of mortification, but in the performance they become easy and welcome, even as the stake, the fire, the sword, and the wheel were as perfumed flowers to the martyrs of old, because they were devout. And if devotion can soften torture and death itself, can it not lighten the daily path of duty? Sugar sweetens unripe fruits, and neutralizes the acidity of those which are already ripe. So true devotion is a spiritual sugar which takes away the bitterness of mortification and the danger of gratification. It counteracts the poor man's discontent and the rich man's self-satisfaction, the loneliness of him that is oppressed and the vainglory of the successful, the sadness of him that is alone and the dissipation of him that is in society. It is as fire in winter and dew in summer. It knows how to abound and how to suffer need. It draws some good alike from honor and contempt. It accepts both joy and suffering with an even spirit, and fills us with a marvelous sweetness. Consider Jacob's ladder, which is a faithful representation of the devout life. The two sides between which we ascend and which support the steps are prayer, which brings the love of God, and the sacraments which confer it. The steps are but the various degrees of charity by which we advance from virtue to virtue, either descending in action to the aid of our neighbor, or ascending in contemplation to a loving union with God. Observe further those who tread this ladder. They are men with angels' hearts, or angels with human forms. They are not young, yet they seem youthful, being full of vigor and spiritual activity. They have wings whereon to mount up to God in prayer, but they have also feet whereon to tread the path of men in all holy and loving converse. Their countenances are open and mild, for they meet all things with gentleness and meekness. Their heads and limbs are uncovered, inasmuch as their thoughts, their affections and deeds have no aim or motive but to please God. Their bodies are covered with light, shining garments, for they of a truth use this world and its good things, but after a pure and holy fashion, and no more than is requisite. Such are the truly devout. Believe me, dear Philothea, devotion is the crown of sweetness, the queen of virtues, the perfection of charity. If charity is milk, devotion is the cream. If charity is a plant, devotion is the flower. If charity is a precious stone, its brilliancy is devotion. If charity is a costly balsam, devotion is its fragrance, an odor of sweetness which consoles men and makes the angels to rejoice. Chapter 3. Devotion suitable to all kinds of vocations and professions. In the creation, God commanded the plants of the earth to bring forth fruit, each after its kind. And in a similar way, he commands Christians, who are the living plants of his church, to bring forth the fruits of devotion, each according to his calling and vocation. There is a different practice of devotion for the gentleman and the mechanic, for the prince and the servant, for the wife, the maiden, and the widow, and still further, the practice of devotion must be adapted to the capabilities, the engagements, and the duties of each individual. It would not do were the bishop to adopt a Carthusian solitude, or if the father of a family refused, like the Capuchins, to save money, if the artisan spent his whole time in church, like the professed religious, or the latter were to expose himself to all manner of society in his neighbor's behalf, as the bishop must do. Such devotion would be inconsistent and ridiculous. Yet this kind of mistake is not unfrequently made, and the world, being either not able or not willing to distinguish between true devotion and the indiscretion of false devotees, condemns that devotion which nevertheless has no share in these inconsistencies. No, my Philotea, true devotion hinders no one, but rather it perfects everything, and whenever it is out of keeping with any person's legitimate vocation, it must be spurious. Aristotle says that the bee extracts honey from the flowers without injuring them, leaving them as fresh and whole as she finds them. But true devotion does still better, for it not only hinders no duty or vocation, but on the contrary, it adorns and purifies them. Throw precious stones into honey, and the natural color of each will wax more brilliant. And so every individual adorns his vocation by following it with devotion. Domestic peace is assured, conjugal love strengthened, fidelity to our sovereign more closely treasured, and all occupations rendered more acceptable and agreeable. It is not merely an error, but a heresy, to suppose that a devout life is necessarily banished from the soldier's camp, the merchant's shop, the prince's court, or the domestic hearth. Doubtless, that form of devotion which is purely contemplative, monastic, and religious will not accord with their vocations. But there are other forms of devotion suitable to perfect a secular life. This we may learn from the example of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, David, Job, Tobias, Sarah, Rebekah, and Judith in the Old Dispensation, and in the New from St. Joseph, Lydia, and St. Crispin in their trades, from St. Anne, St. Martha, St. Monica, Aquila, and Priscilla in their households, Cornelius, St. Sebastian, and St. Maurice in their military charges, and from Constantine, St. Helena, St. Louis, and St. Edward on their thrones. Some even have prospered better amidst the multitude which seems so ill-suited for holiness than in solitude, which appears its most likely soil. Thus St. Gregory remarks that Lot remained chaste whilst in Sodom, and fell into sin after he had forsaken it. Wheresoever we may be, we may and should aim at a life of perfect devotion. Chapter 4. Necessity of a spiritual guide for progress in the devout life. The young Tobias, being commanded to go to Rages, replied, I know not the way. And his father answered, Seek thee a man who may go with thee. And so I say to you, Philotea, if you desire heartily to follow a devout life, seek a holy guide and conductor. Seek where you will, so spoke the devout Avila, and you will never so safely find the will of God as in the path of humble obedience, so well trodden by all the saints of old. When St. Teresa saw what great penances were practiced by Catherine of Cordova, she longed to imitate her, and was tempted to disobey her confessor in so doing. But God said to her, Daughter, thou art in a safe and good path. I prize thy obedience higher than her penance. And so great was her love of obedience, that beyond what she owed to her ordinary superiors, she took a vow of special obedience to a holy man, obliging herself to follow his guidance, which was an infinite blessing to her, and many other pious souls, both before and after her, to subject themselves more perfectly to God, have submitted their will to that of his servants, which is highly commended by St. Catherine of Siena. The pious princess of St. the pious Princess Saint Elizabeth of Hungary submitted with entire obedience to Conrad, and the parting words of Saint Louis, when on his deathbed, to his son were, "Make frequent confession, and choose thee a good confessor, who shall faithfully teach thee in the way of salvation." Holy Writ says that a faithful friend is as a strong defense, and he that hath found him hath found a treasure. A faithful friend is the medicine of life and immortality, and they that fear the Lord shall find him. Ecclesiasticus 6, verses 14 to 16. These words, as you may see by the context, regard chiefly our eternal interests, in which above all we require this faithful friend who will guide our actions by his warnings and counsels, and thereby protect us from the snares and delusions of the evil one. In all our sorrows, our sadness, our falls, he will be as a treasure of wisdom to us. He will be as a physician to give ease to our hearts and help in our spiritual diseases. He will preserve us from evil and forward us in what is good. And when we are conquered by some infirmity, he will save us from being overwhelmed and will raise us from our prostrate condition. But who can find such a friend? The wise man answers, "They that fear the Lord," that is to say, those who are lowly in heart and earnestly desire their spiritual advancement. And be sure, my daughter, that since it is so all important for you to begin this holy course of devotion led by a safe guide, if you heartily pray that God would give you such, he will supply your need in his own way. Doubt not that he who sent an angel to guide the young Tobias will provide you with a good and faithful guide. And when found, he should be to you as an angel. Do not regard him as an ordinary man, nor trust in him as such, nor in his human knowledge, but in God, who will himself guide you through his appointed channel, prompting him to do and say that which you most require. Therefore count him as an angel come from heaven, that he may conduct you thither. Have towards him an open heart in all faithfulness and sincerity, laying bare to him alike your evil and your good, without pretense or dissimulation. By this means, what is good in you will be examined and established, what is evil remedied and corrected. You will be relieved and comforted in your sorrows, moderated and restrained in your prosperity. Place entire confidence in him, mingled with sacred reverence, so that neither reverence should hinder your confidence, nor confidence lessen your reverence. Trust in him with the love of a daughter for a father. Esteem him with the confidence of a son towards his mother. In short, let this friendship be at once loving and firm, wholly sacred, divine, spiritual, holy. And for such you must choose amongst thousands, for there are but few suited to such an office. He must be filled with charity, knowledge, and discretion. Where any of them are lacking, there is danger. But ask such of God, and when you have found what you need, thank his divine majesty and be content. Seek no more, but go on simply, humbly, and trustingly, and your journey will be safe and blessed. Chapter 5. The first step, purifying the soul. The flowers have appeared in our land, says the divine spouse, Canticle chapter 2, verse 12, and the time for pruning is come. What, my daughter, are the flowers of your heart but good desires? Therefore, so soon as they appear, we need the sickle which shall prune away from our conscience all dead works and superfluities. Before the captive maiden might be espoused to the Israelite, she was obliged to shave her head and pare her nails, and put the raiment of her captivity from off her. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 12. And so the soul which aspires to be the bride of Christ must put off the old man, and forsaking sin, be clothed with the new man, paring and shaving away all hindrances which come between it and the love of God. Such a purging of our corruption is the foundation of future health. St. Paul was purged with a perfect purification in a moment, as were St. Mary Magdalene, St. Catherine of Genoa, St. Pelagia, and some others. But such purifications are miracles of grace. Even the resurrection of the dead was a miracle in nature, and we dare not aspire to such. Ordinary purification and healing, whether of body or soul, are accomplished little by little and little, progressing slowly and often hardly at all. The angels who ascended and descended on Jacob's ladder had wings, yet they flew not, but trod the successive steps of the ladder. We may compare a soul rising from sin to holiness to the dawn, which as it rises does not at once dispel darkness, but advances gradually. It is an old saying that a slow cure is a certain cure. Spiritual diseases, like those of the body, come mounted and at full speed. They return on foot and creeping. We must be patient and courageous. It is sad to see those who, finding their attempts after the devout life hindered by various infirmities, begin to grow uneasy, to fret and be disheartened, almost ready to yield to the temptation of forsaking their aim and falling back. But on the other hand, their danger is great, who at the very outset persuade themselves that their imperfections are purified, at once esteem themselves perfected, and seek to fly without wings. Truly, my daughter, having too soon cast aside the physician's care, they are in great danger of a relapse. Arise not until the light cometh, saith the prophet. Rise not till ye have rested. And he himself practices this lesson, and having been already washed and cleansed, prays that he may be washed more thoroughly. The discipline of purification can and must cease only with our life. Therefore be not discouraged by infirmities. Our perfection consists in struggling against them, which we cannot do unless we perceive them. Neither can we conquer unless we come into collision with them. Victory does not lie in ignoring our infirmities, but in resisting them. Therefore, being grieved by them is not consenting to them. Our humility is at times tested by the wounds which we receive in this spiritual combat, but we are never conquered unless we lose our courage or our life, and our spiritual life can be extinguished only by mortal sins, not by imperfections and venial sins. Therefore, we have the more need to watch that these do not destroy our courage. Deliver me, O Lord, said David, from cowardice and faint-heartedness. It is a favorable feature of this war that so long as we will fight, we must be victorious.